My Spear Weighs Heavy in My Hand by Jack Anderson. Part 4. Long Live the King. Speak. Speak to me. Speak to me, mighty ones. Speak from the darkness, and I will give gifts to you. I had heard the shamans back home chant those words, the same chant Yasmin was singing in the olive grove. I woke to the sound of it, and the distant noise of some shrieking bird crying out in the night. It was a strange awakening. I opened my eyes to see clouds gently floating by in a purple sky, night birds wheeling above me as the sun set. When I sat up, my back crunched painfully. I had been spending too long sleeping on the ground outside, and I was no longer quite in the full flower of my youth. I winced, uncomfortable, in pain, and opened my eyes again to see Yasmin still chanting. Her eyes were shut, and she was concentrating furiously. I knew that the shamans would often lose themselves in a trance, and would become enraged if we were to interrupt, so I picked my way through the grove in the fading light to drink deep of the river water. It was cool and clean. West of the town and upstream, the river flowed with an urgency here, lined with trees and grass, and the crocodiles and beasts of the desert stayed far away. I could see the sails of the foreign ships still, rippling darkly against the darkening sky. I thought then about the river at home, a river I would never see again, about how the nomads from far to the west would sail past us on little boats they had made from animal skins. They would sail along on these little boats, then dismantle them to trade with the men to the east. When they travelled back to their homes, going through our town before slipping through the secret mountain paths that they were forbidden to teach, they would trade with us and bring us news. But as they arrived and passed us by, they would sing beautiful songs, in a language that lilted and rolled and rang out through the town. We would gather to watch them and wave, and they would splash water at the children as they played on the riverbank. The pang of loss returned. Grief visits us uninvited and outstays its welcome. It fills the hole left by whatever we have lost, fills it with anguish. I stayed, looking at the river, letting the pain flow away with the water until I was ready to be part of the world again. When I returned to Yasmin, she was still chanting. I sat on the ground, leaning against one of the olive trees, waiting for her to finish communing with the spirits. I was relieved, truth be told, to realise that for all her talk she was simply a shaman, albeit one from much further away. Shamans commune with spirits and the gods. Shamans have strange and secret ways. They learn strange and secret things, and it made sense to me to think of her that way. I was wrong, of course, but the lie comforted me. I could barely hear what she was saying. I could make out some of her whispers, a soothing sing-song voice. What multitude? Come back. Come to me, I beg you. Yes, he's with me. Wait. Stop. What do you mean, a familiar scent? Come back. Come back. She let out a long sigh, blinked a few times and shook her head. Did they have much to tell you? I asked. I don't know, said Yasmin. They take coaxing sometimes, and I'm a stranger here, so they were dismissive and haughty, and I think they were about to speak, but they fled. They all fled. Is that usual? I said. No, said Yasmin. It's rare. The place they inhabit has tides and seasons of its own. Perhaps some thunder struck or some horror roared nearby. Did they at least tell you where Babu is? I asked. Oh yes, said Yasmin, smiling brightly in the dark. We left the horses and made our way back into the city. The moon was near full, and there were oil lamps burning in every doorway this early in the night. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, and a fresh breeze blew from the east, a cold breeze. I fancied that it carried a gentle scent, though one I could not name. We could see no guards. We could see very little in the gloom of night, but we could hear people talking and laughing through their open shutters. It was that time in the night when people had not yet gone to their bed, and the oil lamps still burned, and the people would talk and wander and breathe the night air before bedding down. Tomorrow was the first day of a new decan, the 10-day week the Febecians used, and all the royal craftsmen would be back at their work alongside the peasantry. Tonight they would rest, and as the city grew quiet I found myself squatting in a herb garden with Yasmin, once again following her lead. I confess it stung my pride a little to follow a woman hither and yon, but she was more clever than I and knew the ground. Besides, I have long known I am not a natural leader. My talents lie on the field of battle or in the duelling ring. I am no strategist, and I felt I loved her, and perhaps my pride was misplaced. I knew brave women and cowardly men, strong women, men who would not rise from their beds until the sun was at its zenith. I had no time to dwell further on my gripes. We reached a tall building beside a low round house, and Yasmin gestured for me to come closer. "Do you hear anything?" she asked, pointing at the house. I strained my ears, leaning in, waiting for the breeze to die down. "Nothing," I said eventually. I don't know what it was about that place, but the building made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Yasmin assured me Babu was in there, but something like terror tore at my guts as I looked upon it. Perhaps it was the night wind, or the way the glow of the moon lit up an aura behind it, or perhaps it was the stillness radiating from it in a city not yet asleep. Whatever it was, Yasmin clearly felt it too. She shivered beside me. "I don't like this," I said. "There's something wrong here." She nodded and bit her lip with concern. "Perhaps—" "Wait, do you hear that?" she hissed. I strained my ears. There was a dog barking in the distance still. I'd been doing it on and off all night. For a moment, a fraction of a moment, I thought I heard a voice, but there was nothing. "What was it?" I asked, keeping my voice as quiet as I could. "Never mind," she said. "Do you see that?" I had no idea what she was talking about, and it must have shown on my face. "I thought so. Come here," she said, and pulled me close, and reached up and breathed a handful of some dusty substance into my eyes before clamping a hand over my mouth to prevent me crying out. I blinked and bit my tongue. I tried to open my eyes as wide as if to ask her what she had just done, but the pain flashed through me again. I simply batted my eyelids until it faded. "Look again," she said, slowly taking her hand away from my mouth, "and be quiet." I looked, and the world looked different. I could see the house and the tall building beside it made of the white clay of Phobek and the bright corona of the moon behind it, but now it seemed brighter, clearer, not by much, but enough for me to make out the aspect of a man standing by the window, a man wearing a helmet. It was a trap. "I see him," I said. "I see him. What have you done to me, to my eyes?" "Oh, nothing," said Yasmin. "I'll explain it later. It's just a ground herb. You'll have a headache tomorrow, but it will pass." I nodded, still blinking, and looked around me. The night had become much clearer. I could make out details in the paintwork on the buildings we were watching. I could see Yasmin's pupils were huge, like deep pools in the night, and I wondered if that was how I looked too. "What shall we do?" I asked. Yasmin squatted in silence for a moment, chewing her lip while she considered her options. "I shall draw them away somehow," she said eventually, "and you go and get Babu when they leave." I nodded. Seemed a reasonable plan to me. "Shall we meet at the olive grove afterwards?" I asked. "Yes," said Yasmin. "Yes, We shall. The house is small. Be as fast as you can. I nodded again. My heart was in my throat. I sat in silence for 20 minutes. After the first 2 or so, I realised my shoulder was hurting, and I realised it was because I was pushing myself into the wall of the building next to which I was hiding. I was trying to blend in with the shadows and acting like a frightened child. The dog barked again in the distance. I wondered if it was in pain. In the silence of the night I began to hear a distant, low rumble. It grew in intensity, slowly but surely, and then the screaming began. I had heard a call to arms once, in Infobec. It had been a false alarm, a distant dust storm mistaken for oncoming Hashabin raiders. The whole village had rushed in panic, arming themselves and hiding valuables as best they could, until word got around that a mistake had been made. They had laughed then, and I had laughed beside Babu as I saw him hold a khopesh like he had never held one before. Not this time. This time the screams grew louder and more fearful, and the sound of men running in clattering armour mingled with the shouts of the people crying again and again a word that made all shudder in terror, a portent of misery and violence, the enemy of all mankind. Deva. I almost fled myself, in truth. I had no stomach for a fight with those horrors. I reasoned that I could come back later and take Babu from whatever ruins the Deva might leave. Here, in Infobec, they rarely attacked in force, preferring instead to snatch wary travellers by night. They crawled here, beneath the earth, in heaving, grey-skinned throngs, mouths round and full of rings of teeth, slurping and growling in their repulsive tongue as they chanted their hatred of man and forged vile weapons from the metals in the deepest depths. I stayed. I stayed for Babu. The alarm was too loud to ignore, even for the men lying in wait in the building across the road. I saw 4 figures rush from the low house, khopeshes in hand, waiting for a beat, chose my moment, and bolted for the door. I was in there in a heartbeat, rushing through the open front doorway and into a pitch-dark room. I stopped. Beside me, just barely visible, was a rack of weapons. I reached out, and for the first time in years I held a spear in my hand, and felt complete again. I hefted the spear, held it level with my head, and began to edge forward into the dark. My eyes were adjusting to the deeper darkness inside, making out the dim silhouettes of a table and 3 chairs, and listening to the muffled screaming of 3 figures bound to them. As my eyes grew accustomed to the darkness, I saw that Babu was before me, frantic, rocking backwards and forwards in his chair. I hurried behind him, swiftly slit the rope binding his wrists, and went to free the next man as the light rose. I assumed it was Babu, lifting the hood of a nearby lantern, and thanked him, and looked up, and saw Brokos standing before me in gleaming armour. I could barely see his face while he wore his helmet. He covered his cheeks and his nose completely, and left his eyes sunk deeply behind it. His thick black beard bristled beneath it. He held a spear and a shield with an easy confidence, and thrust it toward me with astonishing force. But I too knew how to fight with a spear. I just barely knocked his blow aside. The blade of his spear flickered past me and slashed a deep gash into my left arm. I fought the terror down and rushed forward, pushing Babu to the floor, and shoved into Brokos with all the strength I could muster. He barely moved. The man was a wall, a tower of muscle and bronze with a horsehair plume atop his helmet brushing the ceiling. I did the only thing I could think to do, and tried with all my might to lift his helmet off his head. He wasn't having it. He dropped his spear and drove his massive, gauntleted fist into my ribs. The pain was intense, and I felt something crack inside me as he drew back and landed another savage blow. His eyes shone bright in the lamplight, pinpricks in darkness, deep inside his helm. I could see them narrow. And all of a sudden they weren't there. I was looking at bronze. Babu had managed to creep behind Brokos and lift and twist his helmet with help from one of the people who'd been strapped to a chair beside him. All three of them, Babu and the two men with him, pushed and clawed at Brokos's massive body until the man finally lost his balance and fell. I moved to finish the job, to stamp on his head and body until the man breathed his last, but Babu grabbed me by the wrist and screamed at me to run, and we fled into the night. At some point I realised I had remembered to take the spear with me, and I was dragging Babu behind me, keeping my eyes peeled for Yasmin. I had no idea where we were going. Instead, I blindly followed the two men with Babu as we fled pell-mell toward the river. There were guards running towards us, and for a moment I thought to stop and plant my feet, ready to fight, but they ran past us, crying out about the threat of Deva, and we ran on. Doors and windows were shut and barred around us, and the streets fell silent. When we reached the olive grove again, we stopped. We breathed deeply, sat heavily, drank deep of the water skins Yasmin and I had left behind. Babu shook his head, blew out his nostrils, and swore a curse I did not know. "I am getting very sick and tired," said Babu. "Very sick and tired of being hit in the head. I do not like people who hit me in the head. I do not like foreign barbarians hitting me in the head. I do not like that you, my friend, have rescued me twice over now. I want to go home. I just want to go home." I sat beside him, sighing a long sigh. "We need to go to Obek. We need to speak to the king. With Yasmin at our side, we should be given an audience, at least. And then he can call off his men, and we should be safe. Come on, Babu, you know there's no other way." "I know that," he shouted. "I'm not a simpleton. I know. I want to go home. You always talk to me like I'm a fool. I want to go home. I know I can't. I know." He sat there, pouting, and for once I was angry with him. He was an emotional man, and a mess, but he rarely took the time to consider anyone's feelings but his own. I stood, slowly, grunting at the pain in my ribs, and quietly told him I was going to stretch my legs. I was in no mood for an argument there and then. None. I walked deeper into the grove, swearing under my breath, trying to calm down. I had survived a fight with Brokos, barely, and I needed to take enough time to let my terror and rage ebb away. I breathed the night air, feeling it catch in the back of my throat as a chill breeze blew, and heard the trumpets calling in the distance to signal the emergency was over. I briefly wondered what had caused it, what the Deva had done to provoke such a panic, but let my mind drift instead to happier times. I remembered hunting in the southern plains, that great expanse of fertile soil before the enemy had come. I remembered my father laughing as I fled from a scorpion and deftly lifted it by the tail with a broad grin, shaking his head at my fear. "It is harmless," he had said. "A greenback. They eat flies and spiders, not little boys." I laughed then too, and watched it writhe between his fingers, legs scrambling at the air. It was the memory I had of him that I was sure was clean, precise. I knew in my heart that I saw his face when I thought of that day, unsullied by the gulf of time and the fickle nature of memory. I had no memories of my mother, of which I was so sure. A vague sense she had been plump, but had grown slim from some wasting illness before the god of death took her from me forever. By gods, I was in a melancholy mood, wasn't I? I always became gloomy after a battle. Perhaps I remembered those who I had fought beside and lost. Perhaps it was the price we pay for that heart-pounding battle joy that sears through the soul in the heat of combat. Perhaps a small part of me was disappointed to have survived. I basked in the night air, not yet ready to speak with Babu or his cousins. There were still hours until dawn, and there was no sound of pursuit. We were safe again for a little while. I knelt down beside the river, watching carefully as the moonlight glinted from the rippling water. It was so clear I could see the stones on the riverbed, could see the fish darting about. I reached slowly down, resting the back of my hand on a rock, felt the cold water try to numb my arm, and forced myself to hold still, picking my moment, waiting. Ha! I could not hold it in, so I let out a shrill cry of joy as I triumphantly lifted a narrow, silver-scaled fish into the air. I drew my knife, a small and wickedly sharp thing that Yasmin had given me, and dispatched the creature to the next world. I began to say the prayer of sacrifice, then faltered, as I remembered it was a prayer for the goddess of another river, one far from here, across the desert, worshipped by a people lost to the world. Would the goddess of this river understand? Would they reject my offering? I had no idea. I said the prayer anyway. All waters meet, all rivers lead to the great dark oceans. The goddess of this river would most likely understand. What are you praying for? Yasmin's voice startled me, but I was glad to see her away from the others, away from the chaos, away from Babu and the men I had not yet even brought myself to speak to. Just giving thanks, I said with a smile. We always used to thank the river for its bounty, or the desert, or whichever god or wanderer we felt was nearest. That's good, she said, stepping closer. I have arranged for us to sail north at dawn. The guards will not leave the town to search for us with the threat of the Deva nearby, and the ships will meet us a little way downriver. We are safe. We have time. It took me a moment to realise what she meant. I did not sleep very much that night. Gamal and Pinadjem were, it turned out, quite easy to get on with. They had grinned at me in a knowing, slightly cheeky way when I returned to our enclosure in the olive grove. Gamal had even snuck back into town to steal away some of their belongings before the chaos died down, and had brought with him a mighty haul of food and beer for the journey. Pinadjem was limping. He had twisted his ankle while we ran, and Babu and I were unharmed. I felt buoyed, confident. Soon we would be underway, and far from here. Gamal sang as he cooked our breakfast, the fish I had caught earlier in the night. He had a nice voice, high and smooth, and Pinadjem rolled his eyes at the bawdy words he sang. I could see a family resemblance between Pinadjem and Babu, though Pinadjem was far slimmer and younger, with far more well-defined cheekbones. Gamal looked nothing like either of them, but had very striking eyes. They glowed with a barely hidden inner mischief. "So, I said. "Babu tells me you sell pelts for him?" I was trying to start a conversation while the fish blackened. "We do," said Gamal, sipping from a wineskin. "Among other things, for other people. We sell a lot of incense, too. Babu tells me you're his right-hand man. You're looking for some people." "I am," I nodded, then realised there was something in the tenor of his voice, something in his look, that meant he knew more. "I am. Where are they? Have you heard something? Please, please." The words had tumbled out of me in a shout, desperate and pleading. I felt like something distant and forgotten was rekindling within me, something so doused and weak that it had been forgotten and obliterated from me, and in an instant I felt I was learning to feel it once again. "Calm yourself," said Gamal. "I've not heard much, though we asked every trader who came by for the last year. There was nothing for a long time, but we had heard a woman with very dark skin was seen at the palace." "Her name?" I asked, fighting the urge to grin too broadly. "I have no idea," said Gamal, "and the merchant who told the tale was Hassani, and he's a notorious drunken and a liar. But so am I, so don't hold that too strongly against him." I liked Gamal a lot. The ship came into view just after dawn, just as I had grown so tense I had begun to bite my nails. The huge painted sail fluttered majestically in the cold light, and we swam out to clamber up the lowered rope ladders as swiftly as we could. The town was very clearly in sight, and all of us had to simply pray we were not seen, and that no alarm would be raised. The captain's name was Polima, and I confess again that I was shocked to find a woman in charge. I learned later that it was common practice among the Rubicians, that they believed the sea god despised all men. In the meantime, I felt myself needing again to adjust to these foreigners, to make space in my mind for practices I had never before considered. Polima was almost as tall as me, with hair cut to a finger's width and very few teeth. She went about barefoot on board ship, wore short trousers that came to a halt just below the knee, and a tight linen tunic. She was in her late 40s, though the years of salt and brine made her look much older, and we quickly found out the reason she was so happy to let us on her ship. "I fucking hate Dastrans," she said, while she was helping me onto the deck. "They're bastards, and you've made a Dastran very angry, so I like you. And there he is." I looked where she was pointing, stumbling slightly as I felt the deck move under me, and there he was, Brokos, standing some way off on the riverbank with a dozen of his men, shouting at the top of his lungs. We could not make out his words, but the obscene gestures he was making were clear enough. When he broke his spear across his knee and hurled the pieces into the river, I was fairly certain he had reached the height of his rage. Fairly certain. Then Polima started screaming insults back at him from the rear of the ship. I think I expected her to stop and sail away, but honestly that was because I did not know her. She was a forceful woman, screaming a shrill stream of insults that never seemed to end. The rest of the crew busied themselves setting the ship to sail away, stopping only to laugh when she turned around, bent over, and showed Brokos her entire arse. He must have stormed away eventually, I assume. There was no way Polima had grown tired of her sport. She seemed unstoppable. A while passed in peace, and I grew tired of watching the town and all its nightmares disappear behind us, and turned to see Babu in conversation with a now calmer Polima. He was turning on his charm, which oozed out of him whenever he smelled an opportunity for trade, and it always worked. "So then," he was saying, "we were kept in the dark for hours by that brute Brokos and his men. They beat us, demanded to know where our friends were, but of course we would not say a word.
I myself was not so brave as poor Penajim, who, as you can see, was beaten very badly. They were just coming to Gamal when the alarm sounded, and you can imagine our relief and, yes, trepidation at the sound. The Deva, the dreaded Deva, well, Gamal started to wriggle as much as he could, and the men ran from the room to take up arms against the beast, but Brokos, the coward, stayed to watch over us lowly prisoners. He stood there in his tattered cloak and glared at Gamal until he was still. I believe Gamal was unafraid, but Brokos was armed, and Gamal was tied to a chair, so I damn well was afraid, Gamal interjected. He had sat by the side of the boat, and was eating figs he had managed to find somewhere while Penajim sat beside him, and to my surprise rested his head upon his shoulder. I was terrified, Gamal continued. The man's a mountain, and he always sounded bloody furious, even when he was collecting taxes. He's a menace. He's an exile, said Polima. That tattered cloak means he's an exile. Did you know that? It means he's a traitor. A Dastran traitor. The worst kind of bastard. She practically spat the words. Even Babu, usually impervious to the vagaries of other people's feelings, was taken aback by the depths of her hatred. "Why do you loathe them so?" he asked. "Because they're pigs," replied Polima. "They raid everywhere around them, swan about into our cities like burglars, and steal whatever they find. They mutilate their priests for sport, they keep a whole Rubician nation enslaved, they practice human sacrifice, they're thieving, relentless, monstrous pigs, all of them. And I hate them." Polima's venom faded, but the simmering hatred clearly remained. Babu finished the tale of his capture and rescue with great embellishment, though he told me the truth later. He had walked into the house of his cousins, who I now could see were most certainly not related to each other, and had been detained by furious guardsmen that evening. It made sense. The messengers from Phobek had arrived, and once Brokos had seen us flee the palace, he had sent out word there were men wanted in the city. We were hunted, and presumed guilty of the murders of the Crown Prince. Yasmin stood beside me on the deck. I confess I had some difficulty adjusting to the way the ship swayed underfoot, and that stomach-churning sensation had quite entirely erased my previous awe at the grandeur of the vessel. I had let my head hang over the side of the taffrail. "You'll get used to it," she said in a soothing voice. "I found it took me a little while before I found my sea legs." "We aren't in the sea," I said. "It's just a river. I can still see the banks." Yasmin smiled. "True," she said, "but we can see the sea from here, the darker blue beneath the sky before us." I looked where she was gesturing, and saw the sea for the first time. I wish I could say that I was enraptured, stunned with the vast and sublime beauty of the unending depths, but I am afraid I simply felt horribly ill. I leaned back over the taffrail. "Very nice," I said. She laughed at the state of me, and though my pride was stung, I could not help but laugh as well. She had a filthy laugh, shook her whole body and took hold of passers-by, and it lightened my day when I heard it. A half-hour later, and I felt a lot better. Yasmin had spent the time speaking with me in soothing tones, taking my mind off the rolling sensation on board the ship. It had helped, and I found I could freely walk around and enjoy the sound of the sails fluttering in the breeze without also feeling I was about to lose control of my stomach. "They are not related," I said at one point, gesturing towards Penadjem and Gamal as they leaned upon each other, gazing out toward the shore. "No," agreed Yasmin. "They are not. They are like Polima." I gave her a quizzical look. "Touched by Illyria?" she said. Then, when I still looked baffled, she said, "They are together. A couple." "Oh!" I said. It was rare among my people, but such unions were not unheard of. I felt a fool. "What did you mean when you said they're like Polima?" I asked, still a little mystified. "Just that she has tastes that
run against the customs of her people, said Yasmin. I have met women like her before. They're always formidable, and in Rubissia they often seem to take to the sea. I do not know why. I knew what she meant, and I reddened. I remembered Callista, the feared old spinster who ran the temple to Baal Oris before it had burned. I remembered the rumours that had swirled about her, and how invincible she had seemed, until a spear had pierced her side on the temple steps, and her blood ran down in a gushing stream, until the day our city burned. I missed her. Missed the feeling of being around her, fear and awe in equal measure. She had been a fine priestess. Well, I said, after a moment's pause, what a day. And Yasmin laughed again, that light and airy laugh. I joined in, happily infected by it. Yes, she said at length, what a day. And now we can relax for a little while. In a few short hours we'll be at sea, out of reach of those who wish to do us harm, and Polima will sail us straight into the heart of Obek. All is well. All was not well. Another hour passed in relative peace, and I rested on a hammock below deck. I dozed, gazing up at the wood on the ceiling as the shadows danced as the lanterns swayed with the ship. It was restful, even peaceful. The only sound was the groaning of wooden beams and the occasional crewman making his way past. I was thinking about the gods and the wanderers, about Xinthippe and her stalwart defence of our land while the gods scourged the surface of the world of the wretched Deva. Where was her mirror? Where were my companions? A woman from my tribe could be in Obek. It could be her. I would have to find her. I would beg if I had to. Anything at all. Anything for any sliver of hope. The sound of running feet startled me from my rest, and I clambered gracelessly from the swaying hammock. It took me far too long to extricate myself, and when I finally made it up to the deck, I saw half the crew were already there. So was Yasmin, pointing to something on the shore. I looked out, and saw the road ran beside the wide river here, a good way off, some 100 feet away at least, and stretched over the horizon. "Oh, gods!" called Babu from the foredeck, his voice quivering with misery. "Oh, no, no, no. The black chariot." I squinted as my eyes adjusted to the daylight from the dimness below decks. 4 black horses pulled the black chariot. The rider was swathed in dark rags that fluttered out behind him, a black banner raised high above his head. Braziers burned incense upon the chariot, tended by smaller figures, swathed also in black rags. Black smoke billowed out and mingled with the dust cloud left in its wake. I stared at it in incomprehension. It was mesmerising, horrifying, like a nightmare. Babu sounded distressed, truly distressed, not his usual attention-seeking histrionics. I rushed to him. I felt his sadness in my heart. "Babu," I said, in as soothing a voice as I could muster. "Babu, what's the matter? What does it mean?" Babu just stared, tears welling in his eyes. "The black chariot rides out for only one reason," said Gamal behind me, his voice trembling. "There are 4 of them. They ride north and south, east and west. They are fast, but slow as they make their way through cities and towns. Those who see the black chariot are bound by law to tell all who they meet that it has been seen, that the black chariot has ridden out." and the king is dead. Hours passed until the sun swept low to the horizon and the water shone with pink and red reflected light. Babu had calmed, but he and his cousins were distraught in a way I could not understand over the death of a man they had never met. I knew not how to comfort them, and I felt once again like a stranger in a strange land. Their distress faded, but some vestige of it lingered. I began to ponder what could cause such love for a man none of them had even met. Who could draw such emotion at such a distance? Perhaps it was not the man as such. Perhaps it was the idea of the man. As I had wept at the news that the enemy had forded our river to the east, I felt no great love for the rushing waters, and I had never travelled to the place of their crossing. But I had lost something nevertheless. Our land was no longer ours. Our world was smaller. It was no longer sacred, untouched. So their king had died, their god. And until a new king was crowned, would they feel weaker, fragile? Was their world simply a little unmoored? Perhaps I would never know, and I sensed it would be crass for me to ask. We sailed past statues watching over the deep waters, statues of other dead kings, kings with cold, stone eyes.